Hello and welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, flames circling around Jerusalem, causing roads and train lines to close and thousands of people to evacuate. Meanwhile, Israel providing proof to the Associated Press that their offices in Gaza indeed shared space with Hamas terrorist infrastructure. And finally, Secretary of State Antony Blinken calling for an investigation into anti-Semitic educational materials being taught at UN schools. And we begin with breaking news of a massive forest fire breaking out Wednesday afternoon just west of Jerusalem. Fire and rescue authorities saying that the fire is closing in on homes in Abu Ghosh and Yad HaShmona as forces work tirelessly to contain the spread of the flames. At least 29 teams of firefighters and 10 planes joining in on the efforts. Simultaneously, residents of the Judean Hills kibbutz Ma'aleh HaChamisha being evacuated, while nearby roads, highways like Route 1 and train services between Jerusalem and Ben Gurion Airport all closed until further notice. The good news is that hopefully sooner rather than later, fire services spokespersons are saying that the blaze is beginning to come under control. Satellite images captured last year appearing to prove Iranian attempts to conceal its nuclear weapons program. The pictures, taken over several years' time, revealing a site in Sanjarin, Iran, where a nuclear research building and manufacturing plant had been covered up. The plant allegedly used to produce shockwave generators, key components in the miniaturization and detonation of nuclear arms. Meanwhile, Iranian and Western powers continuing nuclear deal negotiations in Vienna, but U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken saying that in light of Iran's malign activities, some form of sanctions will likely remain in place even after a potential agreement is reached.
We don't know at this stage whether Iran is willing and able to do what it would need to do to come back into compliance. So we'll see if that actually materializes. Even in the event of a return to compliance with the JCPOA, hundreds of sanctions will remain in place, including sanctions imposed by the Trump administration. If they are not inconsistent with the JCPOA, they will remain unless and until Iran's behavior changes.
Joining me now with more is international relations expert at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategic Studies and former head of the Foreign Relations Directorate to the National Security Council in the Prime Minister's Office, Mickey Allinson. Mickey, thanks so much for being with us again. Now, what sanctions is Blinken talking about? How strong are the sanctions that will likely remain even with the newly signed JCPOA?
Well, it is obvious that the majority of sanctions, the significant sanctions, would be removed if all parties agree to return to the JCPOA. It would be quite insignificant, and when the U.S. is talking about reaching a longer and stronger agreement afterwards, it is quite unclear what are the leverages it would have to do so. The majority of sanctions would not be binding ones.
So when we say that there are hundreds of sanctions, are we talking about hundreds of small, weak sanctions?
There would be sanctions also that were enacted under the Trump administration, but the Iranians would reach the position they're interested in, which is opening their economy, being able to trade, and still being able to continue with their nuclear program. Also, Secretary Blinken said on Monday that the problem that if the Iranians continue to breach the agreement, the breakout time would shrink to weeks. But the problem is that under the JCPOA, breakout time is allowed to shrink to weeks starting from 2023, when the sunset clauses begin to apply. So from 2023 till 2030, it would be legal to enrich uranium, to use advanced centrifuges. And this is exactly why Israel opposed the agreement, because the JCPOA does not solve the question of Iranian nuclear weapons. It only postpones it.
So let's move now to internal Iran. How are Iranian officials, especially presidential candidates ahead of Iran's elections, discussing the sanctions and the JCPOA nuclear deal?
Well, we know that elections are coming. We see that the majority, if not all, candidates are what is considered to be non-moderate ones. Not that I think there are really moderate ones, because the person who decides who will run is the council and the supreme leaders. So to begin with, it's not a question of election, it's a question of selection. And they will all do their best to remove the sanctions as agreed, and it seems to be a done deal. The JCPOA, returning to the JCPOA, seems to be a done deal.
All right, so we're seeing reports now that since the United States is seemingly dead set on returning to a deal, as you're saying as well, Gulf nations like Saudi Arabia and the UAE are returning to talks with Iran of their own. What do you know of these reports and these alleged discussions? And also, do you see a peaceful resolution to the conflicts with Iran taking shape? Or do you think that maybe some of these efforts are just futile with respect to the mullahs and the Ayatollah regime in Tehran?
Well, everybody's trying to hedge their bets, and Gulf states are noticing the American fatigue from the Middle East. They're noticing the fact that the U.S. is interested in focusing elsewhere in its internal problems in Asia, and they're trying to hedge their bets. The Gulf states are not interested in appearing as a serious opposition to the U.S. They are interested in appearing as promoting U.S. interests, which is stabilizing the Middle East and reaching some sort of a stabilization between Sunni nations. There isn't really a Sunni axis, and the Shia axis, and that would promote what they perceive as promote American interests. But there's also difference in the Gulf itself. The UAE agreed to what is called the Gulf Standard, which is not pursuing a nuclear fuel cycle. Saudi Arabia did not agree to that. And everybody's saying, justly so, why not have the same capacities that Iran has that did not agree, of course, to anything like the gold standard.
So it sounds like a policy if Iran has it, then why can't we? Which I think goes against the non-proliferation agreements. But in the meantime, I'm sorry to cut you off, but thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your insights with us, Mickey Allinson.
Thank you.
Now, speaking of providing proof, Israeli ambassador to the UN and United States, Gilad Erdan, meeting with the heads of the Associated Press in New York, providing evidence of Hamas's activities in the Al-Jalaa Tower in Gaza, which housed both the AP and Al Jazeera teams before being targeted by Israel in May. Israel destroying the building during the 11-day conflict with Hamas last month, arguing that Hamas operatives were using offices in the building to develop a jamming system meant to disrupt Israel's Iron Dome missile defenses. No casualties were reported in the strike. Still, despite reporting a positive and constructive conversation with Erdan, the AP is claiming that it has not yet seen any sufficient evidence of Israel's allegations. Here to discuss, Director of the American Jewish Committee and former head of the IDF spokesperson's foreign media unit, Lieutenant Colonel in the Reserves, Avital Leibovich. Lieutenant Colonel, thank you so much for being with us. Now, Gilad Erdan is saying that he coordinated with the IDF to declassify enough materials to give to the AP. The AP is saying that they've not been given anything, or at least not enough. What do you make of this?
Well, since I've been through so many IDF operations in Gaza, I can tell you that this is not the first time we have been seeing and witnessing Hamas using civilian facilities, such as the international media buildings. There are a few of them in Gaza. And I remember that time and time again, Hamas has been using them in routine times as well as in emergency times. As a matter of fact, I can refer you to many interviews I gave in 2012, this is 9 years ago, in which I explained to the foreign media, again, regarding this building and how Hamas actually spread a whole network of antennas on the rooftop of the building in order to provide for its own terroristic purposes. This was 9 years ago. So this is not something new. I really do not understand how the AP CEO has the idea that there is no connection between Hamas and the media building. I think that the IDF could have done better providing the proof in real times rather than in a delay of a couple of weeks. I guess it has to do with some kind of intelligence reasons. But at the end of the day, this is no surprise. Hamas has been using for decades civilian infrastructure for its own needs.
Well, so more to what you were just talking about in terms of how the IDF might be able to do a better job. The IDF declassified intelligence for Erdan to show to the Associated Press. Why not declassify enough to be released to the general public? Because so far the general public has not seen what Erdan claims to have shown the AP either.
Well, I think that I did see actually the IDF releasing some sort of information immediately after Erdan's meeting. I guess it has to do again with intelligence capabilities. There's always a dilemma. On the one hand, there's the thirst of the public to hear and learn and see the proof immediately. And on the other hand, there are intelligence sources which you don't want to burn really, because they are the ones who provide the information. So there's always a very delicate balance between these two factors. And I understand that in this situation, the same balance took place again. But I think it's sufficient that a democratic country like Israel comes forward and explains what kind of infrastructure Hamas has built in the building, publicly, officially. I think that should be a sufficient reason to understand the need to take down this facility.
All right, so going back to the AP, the IDF and Gilad Erdan both made clear that they no longer believe the journalists were really aware that their Hamas neighbors were in the building. You're saying that that's not necessarily true. How do we know?
Yeah, it's not necessarily true because you have to keep in mind that in addition to AP, there were also other many local freelancers and journalists using these offices in the building. And think about it logically. It's a tall building. You take the elevator every day to work. You don't see Hamas people in the elevator with you or surrounding you or parking their cars downstairs next to your car. Seems to me kind of odd to not see any Hamas member hanging around the building for years and years. Now, keep in mind, this did not only happen for the 11 days of operation in Gaza. This was prepared well in advance. So for a very long time, this infrastructure has been built, including meetings of commanders there and different kinds of, I would say, professionals who brought their specific material there. So I just find it very hard to believe that no one ever have seen Hamas terrorists in the building.
All right, Lieutenant Colonel Avital Leibovich, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, now a Palestinian Jordanian terrorist and Israel's longest-serving Jordanian prisoner receiving a hero's welcome as he crosses back into Jordan on Tuesday. The now 46-year-old released after decades in jail for his December 2000 attack. Chana Rifkin reporting.
20 years ago, I made a journey not for tourism, but for resistance. So says the Palestinian Jordanian terrorist Abdullah Abu Jaber as he returns home to the Baqqa refugee camp outside of Amman. Israel releasing him at the end of his 20-year prison sentence on Tuesday. Abu Jaber convicted of planting a bus bomb in Tel Aviv on December 28, 2000, and detonating it remotely, injuring 13 civilians. He'd originally entered Israel amidst the thousands of Jordanians who came to find work in the country, following the normalization between Israel and Jordan back in 1994. Far from sorry for his indiscriminate attack, however, the former inmate calling on political and militant Palestinian groups to put aside their differences and unite in arms against the Jewish state. He was welcomed home to a parade of flowers and massive crowds.
In other news, Egyptian engineers, building crews, and equipment flowing into the Gaza Strip now, beginning the process of laying foundation for reconstruction efforts following the war between Israel and Palestinian terror groups in May. Surprisingly, though, rather than taking the aid as it is, many in the Strip are spreading rumors of Egypt's intentions to retake control of Gaza, which it hasn't done since 1967. Senior researcher with the International Institute for Counterterrorism at IDC Herzliya, Dr. Michael Barak with the details. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, do you think that there's any truth to all of the rumors of Egypt wanting to retake Gaza?
I think it's an exaggeration. All these headlines about the intention of Egypt to take over Gaza. Egypt is not interested to do that. It's only interested to promote its regional interest, mainly to continue with the traditional role of mediating between the Palestinian Authority to Hamas. And also there is a very important factor, the Biden administration, the Egyptian regime of Sisi is interested to signal to Biden that Egypt is playing a very important role in the conflict between Israel to the Palestinians, because we know that the human rights situation in Egypt is not very good, and there is a growing tension between the Biden administration to the Egyptian regime about this topic. So Egypt thinks that by playing the Palestinian card, it can prevent any pressure by the American administration to improve the human rights. So speaking about the releasing of political prisoners. So this is one main factor. The second factor is that Egypt is worried that during the Trump administration, that the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and other Sunni states that normalized the ties with Israel, Egypt is afraid that the regional role will diminish. So by playing the Palestinian card and getting inside the Gaza Strip, Egypt thinks that by this it will, let's say, block the influence of United Arab Emirates and the other Sunni states.
So Egypt is, as you mentioned, taking a more active role in the Strip right now. But can you maybe detail exactly what that means? What activities are they engaged in, and why now? What changed exactly to make Egypt take this new involved position?
First of all, also there is the economic factor. We know the Egyptian army is deeply involved in the economics of the country, and by sending these, let's say, trucks and humanitarian aid and the plans to reconstruct Gaza, it's also contribute to the economy of Egypt. Now, Egypt reached to an agreement with Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, also to fight against the ISIS presence in Sinai Peninsula. So Egypt, as I mentioned, has this economic interest, security national interest. And why now? Nobody expected to the conflict between Israel to the Palestinians in Gaza, Hamas. So that's why Egypt decided to involve. And maybe I can mention that there are criticism among Islamists in Gaza and outside, especially among the Salafis, who don't like Hamas, and they say that this is a threat. If Egypt will get inside Gaza, it means that the Muqawama, the resistance of the resistant axis or the resistance, the jihad in Gaza against Israel will come to an end. This is a threat, and that's why the Salafis, they are signaled to stop the Egyptian involvement inside Gaza. But Hamas is not letting them to do that.
All right, Dr. Michael Barak, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Moving on, United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken promising to investigate the UN Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA, for its continuous and progressively anti-Semitic content taught to Palestinians in UNRWA's school curriculum. And Blinken testifying before a Senate committee, likewise saying that D.C. will condition further aid to UNRWA on related material reforms. But all this in light of a report released by the independent educational watchdog Impact SE in January, the first ever review of UNRWA's teaching materials. And here to give us more is CEO of Impact SE, Marcus Sheff. Marcus, thanks so much for joining us again. How closely have you been working with the White House, and do you believe Blinken, and by extension the Biden administration, to be sincere in pushing for these reforms?
Thank you. Yes, we have been working with the State Department on this issue. That is to say, we briefed them, and at their request, we sent policy recommendations in relation to UNRWA education. But I think this is a really important moment. Mr. Blinken presented that State Department budget to Congress, and he acknowledged very clearly that UNRWA's educational materials contain anti-Semitism. He called out, and I quote, the abuse of the system, and said that the US is determined that UNRWA pursue those very necessary reforms. So, this is really an important moment. These comments constitute the first time that this administration has acknowledged that UNRWA's educational content does contain hate, does contain extremism, does contain anti-Semitism.
All right, now, Blinken also alluded to looking into the measures that UNRWA says it's taking to address these concerns. Do you know what these measures include?
Well, there has always been a veil of uncertainty around UNRWA's statements in relation to the measures that they are taking. It has never been clear. And, for several years now, UNRWA have, made these statements about the various different mechanisms that they have in place in order to look at the curriculum. And unfortunately, not one of these mechanisms has ever stood the light of investigation. They are, all kinds of platforms which don't make sense. Ultimately, their own vetted teachers are the ones who created material which is, hateful. And, when I say hateful, I'm talking about students being called upon to defend the motherland with blood. Students being directed to learn about, terrorists and glorification of terrorists. They are, in this material, role models. People like Dalal Mughrabi, who, as you know, murdered 38 people, including 13 children, on a civilian bus. And Israel, which is a UN member state, and UNRWA is, of course, a UN organization, is wiped off all UNRWA-produced material. So, whatever possible platforms they might or might not have, and as I say, none of these platforms have ever stood investigation in the light of day, they're clearly not working. We know that UNRWA's own director in Gaza said there is nothing wrong with the material which we get from the Palestinian Authority and which we teach children. So, I think what we really need here is an external audit. I think the idea that UNRWA... Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to add to what you were saying, because in a statement of yours that you've previously made, you said that, quote, despite telling donor countries for years that it combats incitement in the Palestinian textbooks, in fact, UNRWA's own content is even worse than that of the Palestinian Authority. Where does the buck stop? You mentioned Palestinian teachers and the Palestinian Authority in charge of the curriculum. Where's the oversight in the curriculum?
Well, clearly there isn't any. There are two, if you like, elements of materials here. One is the Palestinian curriculum, which UNRWA teaches unredacted, despite all claims that they make that they do actually change that curriculum. There's no evidence has ever been done. And the other, as I said before, was UNRWA's own created material that was created during the COVID era, which in parts, is worse than the Palestinian curriculum itself. And after this came to light, after we did the research and we put that research out showing the materials that UNRWA are producing, UNRWA provided no evidence whatsoever of when they identified hateful material, because they say that they did, when an internal review, which they said took place, actually took place, what they found. No evidence whatsoever that UNRWA has said what it found in this internal review they say took place, about which we have no evidence. It goes on and on. So, again, UNRWA clearly is not capable, does not, will not regulate itself. And there is an absolute need for an external audit of UNRWA's educational materials. Because in answer to your question, the buck doesn't stop with UNRWA. The buck stops with those donor countries who are giving that money to UNRWA in the expectation that children will be educated and not incited to hate and violence.
All right, Marcus Sheff, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Twice canceled, first due to coronavirus in 2020 and then again last month because of violence surrounding the 11 days of conflict with Hamas terrorists in Gaza, the annual Jerusalem flag parade officially back on. The Israeli Security Cabinet agreeing to schedule the march on Tuesday, June 15th, with a route to be agreed upon between police and flag parade organizers. The organizers, however, still holding out for the original route, which includes going through the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem on the way to the Western Wall. Officials are ignoring police warnings that they cannot appropriately defend such a path, saying, quote, if the police need until Tuesday to get organized, we'll respect that, but we will demand police retain the original route, end quote. All right, that is it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.24 shekels to the American dollar and 2.68 shekels to the Canadian dollar. And finally, for the latest update and news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, as well as to our newsletter at iltv.tv. I'm Aaron Porras. Be well, and thank you so much for watching.